Hey everyone, welcome to the class tonight. This is a recording. I'm not actually here right now. So don't try to ask me questions this week because I'm not going to be here. But if this is premiering live and you're viewing it live, you should be able to interact with each other in the chat if you would like. All right, we're continuing our study on the historicity of the Bible. That's the historical value, the historical reliability of the Bible. Specifically, we're looking at the Old Testament right now. Last week we considered the line of kings, David, Solomon, and some of their descendants. And now we're considering the end of that kingship with the invasion of the Assyrians. So let's get started.
The story of the Davidic monarchy, the line of kings descending from King David, gives us some of the most interesting stories in the entire Bible. Here we experience the full range of what it means to be human: love, hate, glory, defeat, monumental building, destruction, fidelity to God, sin, and failure. These stories are presented to us as history in the Bible, so whether or not they really happened matters. In this lesson, I think some of the evidence for the stories written by the enemies of the Jews is some of the most interesting. But it's God's faithfulness and mercy that really puts a lump in my throat. See if you don't feel the same way.
Today we're going to talk some more about the historicity of the Bible. We've been examining whether or not the Bible is historically reliable. In our last session, we were looking at the evidence for the historicity of the Davidic monarchy. And there we looked at the evidence concerning the beginning of that monarchy, whether or not David was even a real person of history, whether Solomon was a real person of history. We also looked at some of the kings that fell along the middle of those lines of kings. The Davidic monarchy, according to the Bible, stretched from about the year 1000 BC until it finally ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 by the Babylonians. So it lasted for over 400 years in totality. Last time we saw evidence for the historical reliability of the accounts describing events at the beginning of the monarchy, and then later with other kings, both in the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, during the middle parts of the monarchy, that long line of kings. Now we're going to look at evidence of the events that terminated the monarchy. Now this is what the biblical text has to say about this. In the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, in approximately 732 BC, the Assyrian Empire invades the northern kingdom of Israel. Then by 722 BC, it says that Israel's been defeated and King Hoshea has been taken captive. Then in about 701 BC, the Assyrians decide it's time for a new assault. And they come against Judah, which by this time is headed by King Hezekiah. And they come and they conquer the strong-walled cities of Judah, leaving only Jerusalem, and then they initiate a siege against Jerusalem. And that's the story that we're going to tell today. First of all, before we get into that, though, let's just check the first two parts of this story. And let's put it in geographic context. We've got this really nice map here, and we can see that Assyria is one big dude. This is not an empire you want to be messing with. You've got the tiny little kingdoms of Israel in the south and the even tinier kingdom of Judah further to the south of that. And when Assyria comes in 732, Israel does its best, but within 10 years, it has been carted off into captivity. And we know that both from this
If you'll remember, just a very quick history lesson here. The kingdom of Israel split. After Solomon, there was, I think it was Jeroboam took the north and Rehoboam took the south. And there was a split because there was some dispute over the kingship about who was going to inherit the kingdom. And both guys weren't really good, and that's why there was a split. And so when you talk about the Israelite people, sometimes you're talking about Israel proper, but sometimes when you're talking about Israel, you're talking about all the 12 tribes, like everybody. And then you get into this period of time, and it's like, okay, Israel is, or the northern kingdom is talking about that kingdom of Israel there in the blue. The kingdom of Judah, which I think also included the tribe of Benjamin, was the tribe to the south, and it had Jerusalem. And there are two captivities. Assyria takes Israel. Later, Babylon will take Judah. So I just wanted to get you those things clear in your head.
Israel does its best, but within 10 years, it has been carted off into captivity. And we know that both from the cylinders recording the Assyrian battles, their campaigns, as they were called, and also because we have records of the Israelites in the military records of the Assyrians from later on. They were apparently conscripted into the Assyrian military once they were taken captive. So we know that they were conquered, that they were deported, and that they lived for some significant period of time in Assyria. We also know that this last king of Israel was a real guy of history. His name was Hoshea. We found the seal, a little signet ring, bearing his name and the name of one of his officials, Abdi, servant of Hoshea. So we've got great extra biblical corroboration of the existence of this last king and of the defeat that he experiences at the hands of the Assyrians and the subsequent deportation of his people. Okay, so then the story progresses, and in 701 BC, 21 years later, we have Sennacherib coming against Judah. Judah now stands alone, and it says that he came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. So you think about this, you got Jerusalem in the center of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, but now Sennacherib comes and he conquers all the other cities. Do we know that happened? Absolutely. We know it from Sennacherib's prism. He says, "As for Hezekiah, the Judean, who did not submit to my yoke, I surrounded and conquered 46 of his strong-walled towns by leveling with battering rams and by bringing up siege engines. 200,150 people I brought away from them and counted as spoil." Now there's a beautiful mural that's been discovered in Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And the mural shows the siege of Lachish, one of those Judean cities. And it shows in exquisite detail just amazing things. Here's a little more of the text. He says, "I overwhelmed the district of Hezekiah of Judah, Azekah, his stronghold, which is located between my land and the land of Judah. As you're approaching Jerusalem, you have to come through the mountain pass that goes through Azekah and Lachish. These are the last cities to fall." Sennacherib here brags specifically about destroying Azekah. We know that that fell from the biblical text. But we know that Lachish was under siege from the biblical text. It says that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, sent his servants to Jerusalem while he was besieging Lachish. Now, as I mentioned, there's this mural that's been discovered in Nineveh that shows the siege of Lachish. See the little picture to the right. What these are is guys who have been killed, who have been impaled on spears.
All right, you see, this is what they would do. The Assyrians were a ruthless people. You could look up in your own history about the Assyrians, how ruthless they were, and this is one of the things they would do. It's a terror tactic, right? Like, okay, this is what happened to these people. If you go against us, then that's what's going to happen to you. A ruthless people.
Okay, this is very grisly stuff. Okay, they didn't have moving cameras for the 6 o'clock news. But they made murals depicting what happened in these battles. The siege of Lachish also shows these siege ramps. Probably the angle was not realistic. It's a little too tight, but you see all the Assyrian archers coming up the siege ramps, all the Assyrian arrows firing. And we know that Lachish eventually fell. And in fact, excavations of Lachish from this period have uncovered about 1,500 skulls and hundreds of Assyrian arrowheads. Some of these are kind of stylized, but if you can see this guy here, This is one fiery soldier. This is a gnarly dude here. And look at the hairdos. I mean, the Assyrians had a very distinctive style of braiding their beards and their hair. The precision, the realism of these, it grabs you. It takes you back to that period of time. These events really happened. You've got the biblical claim that Lachish is put under siege. You've got the Assyrian campaign cylinders saying the same thing. You've got the Assyrian murals actually depicting the battle. And then you've got the excavation site from that time showing the remains of the battle, the dead and the arrowheads that produced the dead. Did it happen? No question. No question. Now, the story gets more interesting. The 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. And then the king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a large army to Jerusalem. Do you get the scene? What remains? Only Jerusalem. This massive empire has now conquered all the surrounding cities in Judah, and only one city remains, the capital, and that's where Hezekiah is. So Hezekiah, seeing this, first attempts to buy time and to buy off Sennacherib. So the first thing he does is he pays tribute. And we have this recorded in the Bible, and interestingly, it's also in Sennacherib's records. The king of Assyria required Hezekiah, king of Judah, to pay 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, and Hezekiah gave him all the silver which was found in the house of the Lord in the treasuries of the king's house. So the first thing he does is he pays tribute, and then we have that confirmed in the Taylor prison, where Sennacherib himself says, Hezekiah there felt the fear of the power of my arms, and he sent out to me the chiefs and the elders of Jerusalem with 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver and diverse treasures. So we know from the Taylor prism that this part of the biblical account is correct. Slight discrepancy as to how much the tribute was. Sennacherib seems to say it was more, but that kind of is consistent with the braggadocio.
I'll have to look at it. I think it's in the biblical account, 300 silver, 30 gold. And this is 30 gold, 800 silver. So he didn't talk about it, but a discrepancy might be in the biblical account. It said, okay, Sennacherib required this much of Hezekiah. And then it said Hezekiah emptied out the house of the Lord. It didn't say he came up with the right amount. It said he emptied it out. And it shows here that Sennacherib received more. He got the 30 talents of gold, but he got more silver than, according to the biblical account, he asked for. So either Sennacherib's exaggerating his numbers, or Hezekiah overpaid, because it doesn't say he came up with that amount. That he just emptied the house of the Lord.
Of the power of my arms, and he sent out to me the chiefs and the elders of Jerusalem with 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver and diverse treasures. So we know from the Taylor prism that this part of the biblical account is correct. Slight discrepancy as to how much the tribute was. Sennacherib seems to say it was more, but that kind of is consistent with the braggadocio. In any case, both the biblical record and the Assyrian records record this tribute being paid. But now, Hezekiah realizes that's not going to get the job done. All his cities have now been conquered, and we have Sennacherib sending his troops. They're surrounding Jerusalem, and that's where we're going to pick up the story in the biblical text itself. And I want to read you an incredible passage.
This is an awesome reading.
Chapter 32, right at the beginning. And it says, after all that Hezekiah had so faithfully done, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah. He laid siege to the fortified cities, thinking to conquer them for himself. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, and that he intended to make war on Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military staff about blocking off the water from the springs outside the city, and they helped him. Why should the kings of Assyria come and find plenty of water? They said. Then they worked hard, repairing all the broken sections of the wall and building towers on it. And he built another wall outside that one and reinforced the supporting terraces of the city of David. And he also made large number of weapons and shields. Later, when Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and all his forces were laying siege to Lachish, he sent his officers to Jerusalem with this message for Hezekiah, king of Judah, and for all the people of Judah who were there. This is what Sennacherib, king of Assyria, says. On what are you basing your confidence that you remain in Jerusalem under siege? When Hezekiah says, the Lord our God will save us from the hand of the king of Assyria, he's misleading you to let you die of hunger and thirst. Did not Hezekiah himself remove this God's high places and altars, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before one altar and burn sacrifices on it? What's his argument here? Hezekiah has been trying to get you to stop doing idols, but has it done you any good? I've conquered all the rest of your country. And then he goes on to say, do you not know what I and my fathers have done to all the peoples of other lands? Like the impalement we just saw. Pretty scary stuff. Were the gods of those nations ever able to deliver their land from my hand? Who of all the gods of these nations that my fathers destroyed has been able to save his people from me? How then can your God deliver you from my hand? We're going to see it's right at the city walls. They're coming right up to the walls of Jerusalem. And they called out in Hebrew to the people of Jerusalem who were on the wall. Do you get the picture? This is a siege. There's the high wall protecting the city. The Assyrians, their officials, with no doubt the military accumulating behind them, are taunting the people inside this last remaining stronghold.
So that you see more of this terrorism. You get the indication when they were having this parlay between the ambassadors of Sennacherib and Hezekiah. It was, what language are they talking in? Well, it seems that there is some indication that these Assyrians knew Hebrew, and whatever language that they were talking in, at the gate or from the gate or whatever, it was in maybe some different language or something. But then they start, saying it in Hebrew. It's like, okay, there's some other people, from the wall that are listening to us talk, wondering what's going on, but you're talking in different language. Like, we're gonna just start talking in Hebrew, and we're gonna just, we're gonna defy everyone because we want everyone, to be afraid. We want to call everyone out. These guys are good terrorists, in addition to just having a lot of power.
From just below them, where the people are up on the wall, and they're taunting them in their own language. Now I'm going to 2 Kings, where there's a parallel account. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, O Lord God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Give ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and listen to the words of Sennacherib, who has insulted the living God. It is true, O Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them, for they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned after men's hands. Now, O Lord your God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, O Lord, are God. What we find is now the prophet Isaiah comes and he gives a word to Hezekiah, and it comes through the prophet, and this is what he says. Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way he came, he will return. He will not enter this city, declares the Lord. I will defend this city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant, whom we now know is a real person of history. And that night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. And when the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. And so Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew, and he returned to Nineveh and stayed there. And one day while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, and his sons Adramelech and Sharezer cut him down with a sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat, and Esarhaddon, his son, succeeded him as king. Dramatic story. Dramatic story. Did it really happen? Well, let's take another look. According to the text, Hezekiah does these 4 things. He pays tribute, he builds a defensive wall, he secures a water supply, and finally he consults the prophet who tells them it's all going to be all right. That's the prophecy from Isaiah. Let's look at the historical record. First thing we know is there was a water tunnel. Hezekiah made the pool and a tunnel which he brought water into the city. This was his first defensive fortification. That tunnel has been discovered. It connects the pool of Siloam inside the city of Jerusalem with the spring of Gihon. The tunnel dates from this period, about 700 BC. In fact, an inscription has been found on the inside of the tunnel that describes the way the builders, the stonecutters, working from two different directions, obviously in haste, somehow, and we're still not sure, found each other to connect. And when they connected, they wrote the following inscription: "The stonecutters struck each man towards his fellow, axe against axe, and the waters flowed from the source to the pool for about 1,200 cubits. And 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the head of the stonecutters." So they're 100 cubits underground, about 180 feet underground. They've somehow accomplished this amazing engineering feat. They're building in haste, cutting in haste from two directions to connect the pool inside the city to the source of water outside. It's a very difficult engineering feat without, GPS satellites or something. So in any case, this water tunnel, about which we read in Scripture, has been discovered. We can even date it very precisely. This was Hezekiah's tunnel. Okay? Now, secondly, we learn that Hezekiah strengthened the defensive fortifications, and then he built another broad wall, another wall around the city. When I was in Jerusalem, I was on a tour with a guide, and he took us to this incredible broad wall, and he read a passage from Isaiah, which was talking about how this wall was constructed in haste, and he said, you raise the wall and cut down the houses. And we were standing at a place where you could see this wall actually cutting through, cross-cutting through pre-existing houses. And you could see that it had been built in haste. There was a tremendous amount of rubble poured into the middle of this. And this is the defensive fortification of which the Bible speaks, and this is the wall that Hezekiah built, also dating from this period, about 700 BC. Okay, so we know that there was a wall, we know that there was the fortification. What about this deliverance? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. According to the Bible, an angel of the Lord came in the middle of the night and caused 185,000 Assyrians to die. Perhaps there was some confusion, they started to fight among themselves, we don't know, and therefore there was no conquest of Jerusalem. Despite the fact that the most powerful empire in the world was now laying siege to this city, and this city which had no other means of support, military support. All the other cities in Judah had been conquered. What would you think the Assyrians would record about this event? If the Bible was wrong, don't you think they would record that the city had been conquered? Okay, all right? Let's see what they do record. It's very interesting. According to the Taylor Prism, I call this conspicuous silence. This is Sennacherib. He himself I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. Fear of my lordly splendor overwhelmed that Hezekiah. The warriors and select troops he had brought in to strengthen his royal city in Jerusalem did not fight. And I went on to conquer Jerusalem. No, it doesn't say that. Now you see, he records every single other city he conquered, all 46 of them. He records every person he took into captivity, all 200,150 of them. But he says nothing about conquering Jerusalem. Why would that be?
He didn't conquer.
Embarrassing.
It's an embarrassing fact of history for him, isn't it? In fact, it goes further than that. Sennacherib's assassination by his sons is recorded on an Assyrian stela called the Chronicle of Nabonassar. Let's take stock of this incredible account that we have in Scripture and how it stacks up against the extra-biblical evidence that we've also looked at. We have, again, one of these convergent lines of testimony. We've got 6 specific things about which both the biblical text and the secular archaeological records and the documentary evidence from the Assyrian records both agree. We've got things that both sources of information claim about Hezekiah. We've got things that both sources of information claim about Sennacherib. And here's the list. Both Hezekiah and the extra-biblical record claim that Hezekiah fortified the walls of Jerusalem. We know that from the biblical text. We've seen the archaeological evidence of the fortified walls, the broad wall in Jerusalem. We've seen that both the biblical text and the archaeological record document that he secured a water supply by building a tunnel from underneath the city, going from the spring of Gihon into the pool of Siloam. We see that both the biblical record and Sennacherib's cylinder, his record of his own military campaigns, agree that Hezekiah paid tribute initially to buy time, to buy off Sennacherib. We see that the biblical record and the extra-biblical record agree about the actions of Sennacherib. We see that both agree that he conquered the walled cities of Judah. Sennacherib numbers them, 46. The biblical record does not. But we have agreement on that essential point. We see that Sennacherib did not conquer Jerusalem. We see that very clearly explained in the biblical record, and we see that confirmed by the conspicuous silence in Sennacherib's own record of his military campaigns, recorded in the Taylor prison. And then interestingly, we also have evidence that he withdrew from both sources of information and that he was killed by his rebellious sons. That's recorded in 2 Kings 19, but also we saw it in that Assyrian documentary evidence. So we have substantial agreement on these 6 key points about this siege of Judah and Jerusalem that comes from the Assyrian superpower. So now let's step back and look at one other thing. We know that Hezekiah exists from the biblical text. We know that he exists from the Taylor prism. He's mentioned in both sources. But we now have discovered, or archaeologists have discovered, personal artifacts, personal effects of King Hezekiah himself. Those effects are what are called bullae. Bullae is plural for the term bulla, which refers to a little clay stamp. Those little clay stamps have writing on them in the Paleo-Hebrew, in the old form of Hebrew. And what happened in ancient biblical times, in the time period of the kings, the Davidic monarchy, is that kings and their officials would wear these little rings. And they'd have this cool ancient style of Hebrew writing. And then if they wanted to seal an ancient document, they would press it into a little bit of clay like this. This is actually Play-Doh, but you know, you'll get the job done. Okay? And then inside that seal, you would have the certification of the official, his name and title. All right? Now, archaeologists have discovered not one, but 3 separate bullae with the following words: belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah.
Also, so I think we said this was 2011. This came out. In 2018, they found a bulla of Isaiah the prophet, who was a contemporary of King Hezekiah. He talked about a prophecy in the Bible that Isaiah brought a prophecy to Hezekiah, and Isaiah's bulla was found near one of Hezekiah's bullas. So this stuff is still developing. They're still finding stuff.
Let's step back and take a big picture look at what we've been doing. We've been looking at the historicity of the Bible in sections and evaluating each of these portions of biblical narrative. And we've seen that there are different hypotheses about the nature of the text. One hypothesis is the hypothesis of the biblical nihilism, who claim that the Old Testament narrative has no historical value. And the first person that we saw who advanced that view, do you remember his name? Julius Wellhausen. And then we talked about the literary critic Thompson yesterday, who denies that David even exists. I think the evidence against biblical nihilism is overwhelming, and I think we've seen that. The next view is the view of the biblical minimalists, who are only a little bit more favorable towards the Bible. They claim it may contain a tiny historical core. For example, Israel Finkelstein says the Exodus didn't happen, the conquest didn't happen, David may have existed, but he was only a minor tribal official. Okay? Well, I think we've presented some very compelling evidence against that view. When we get to this period of the end of the Davidic monarchy, guess what happens? The minimalists say almost nothing about this. There are no significant challenges to the historicity of these narratives. Why would that be the case? There is such an overwhelming body of evidence in their favor. And I think when you look at the whole swath of biblical history from the patriarchs forward, and you consider the preponderance of the evidence, my own assessment is that this is not a credible view.
So the minimalists, when it comes to things like what we've talked about today and later accounts, it's like they don't look at that because it looks too historical, it looks too historically accurate. They'll go back to really old stuff, 1,000 years before, stuff about Moses or Abraham or the Exodus, things like that, and they'll point out, and obviously extra biblical evidence during that time is just less because it's older. So you're going to find less stuff and less conclusive stuff, and so it's easy for them to throw around their view like, well, there wasn't this or that, and we don't have evidence for this or that. And we've already talked about those periods, so I mean, we've already addressed that. But minimalists won't even speak up when it comes to what we've looked at today and in things that happen even later in history.
That leaves two other possible views. The view of biblical maximalism, which is the view that the Bible contains a substantial core of historically reliable information, which I think is a very credible view in light of everything we've seen. And then a view that goes somewhat further and says the Bible is divinely inspired and true in everything it affirms, both about theology and about miraculous events for which there is not direct attestation. And that view is based on a number of things, some of which we have presented, the historical reliability, the external corroboration of the text. But to make that argument, I think you need some additional ammunition. And we may get to that in an additional part of this course down the road. But for right now, I would say that these two views are both consistent with the evidence. Both are possible views. Next time, we're going to come back and we're going to look at the tale of the other conquest, where there is, again, a dramatic and tragic element in the story, but also an extensive extra-biblical record of corroborating evidence that gives us even more confidence that the Bible is reliable in its historical affirmations.
So whatever happened to Sennacherib? Well, he moved the capital of the Assyrian Empire to Nineveh, modern-day Iraq. There he built a palace without rival. It was almost 2,000 feet long, 70 feet tall, the ruins of which have provided us a wealth of archaeological artifacts. Sennacherib defended Nineveh with a moat and high walls, portions of which can even be seen today. The irony is that despite all of these fortifications, Sennacherib was assassinated by his own two sons.
As Dr. Meyer said, the fun part happens is when you are working between the biblical maximalist and the divinely inspired position. Because if you're already at like the position where like, okay, this is historically reliable text, then you almost, once you get to that point, you almost have to go to the divinely inspired portion, because you just trust everything else that the text says. And there are plenty of biblical maximalists, or they will, archaeologists, historians, they accept the Bible as like, hey, this is a good historical document. So they read that thing about Jericho. It's like, okay, the walls fell down, and they look like, oh, wow, the walls fell out. That's strange. And then they could have gone up it. And so when you get those kind of details filled in, you think, okay, well, why did those walls fall out at Jericho? And it's like, well, maybe it was because that document, the Bible, that said that Jericho fell and it was taken and it was burned and all the spoils were left. Maybe it was because the other part that it was talking about too, how they marched around it and then they blew the trumpets and God made the walls come down. Maybe that's true too. So it gets really interesting once you actually have this good foundation of like saying, hey, see, this is historically reliable. Then you can make that jump to divinely inspired a lot easier. I think people can be convinced that the Bible is true in this way. Now, some people are just resistant to believe. They don't want to believe. And so you can't convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced. But it is certainly a strong argument when you see that all these things that we've looked about from the beginning of the Israelite people to now in this study, it is significant and it's persuasive. All right, guys, thanks for joining. We will see you back next week. I will be back in person, or I plan to be. And have a good rest of the week. Bye.